I now want to graduate from electoral democracy to liberal democracy. Let me just ask, are there any questions before I go ahead? Yeah?
So I guess what's the way in which an electoral democracy, you mentioned before that electoral democracies aren't like perfect democracies. So I guess what's an example, or because it seems like if you have free and fair elections, then that would be enough. I guess what it's.
Well, thank you for asking that, because it raises another issue that becomes more relevant as we shift into this last segment of this lecture. So when we think about liberal democracy, we're going to add on a lot of other elements of relevance for thinking about what is not just a democracy, but a good or higher quality democracy, okay? Now, this complicates the notion of thresholds. Do you have to meet all of these to be called a liberal democracy? No, almost nobody is going to meet all of these other conditions perfectly. There's going to be imperfections in the rule of law, in accountability. Not every elected official is going to feel a strong sense of fidelity to the public good rather than their own personal interest. Interests will always congeal special interests and try to kind of corner advantage to use their influence and their money to get favorable treatment from the state. So this really raises the issue then of, should we even think about democracy in the categorical terms that I'm articulating? There are democracies and there are non-democracies. There are liberal democracies and then there are illiberal or merely electoral democracies. Or should we just recognize this is a scheme of variation that can vary from extremely high quality democracies to, going all the way to, democracies that are clearly of lower quality to all the way to authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. You can look at that issue any way you want. I think it's useful to look at it multiple ways, both with a kind of categorical view of thinking about thresholds, but also understanding that we are on a plane of continuous variation. So measurement becomes both necessary, challenging, and extremely exciting in terms of methodological innovation. And we'll introduce to you in this class some ways of measuring democracy that have different alternative approaches, like The Economist magazine's annual democracy index or the Freedom House ratings or whatever. If you go by those or the Varieties of Democracy project, you see the Scandinavian democracies, Canada, Germany, generally are among the highest quality democracies. The US less so, frankly, and slipped into a lower status of democracy in the last Economist annual index for the year 2017. We'll see about 2018. And then, when you go to many parts of the what used to be called the developing world, we now call them emerging market countries. A lot of those countries also have, by these measurement systems, lower quality democracies. Okay? So I offer the following way of grouping the different dimensions of democracy, of liberal democracy, that we can think of as an inventory for the quality of democracy. And the essay on your syllabus for today by myself and Leonardo Morlino on the quality of democracy spells out this schema in fairly considerable detail. And then we edited a whole book called Assessing the Quality of Democracy, which has a number of case studies that take this this scheme, this framework, and apply it to different pairs of countries in each region of the world. So I'll go through the slides that follow in fairly rapid fire fashion, but I want to spend some time on this slide for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think it provides a useful way. You may find other ways, but I think it provides a useful way of aggregating all these kind of 10, 11, 12 factors, depending on how you're counting, into some sort of scheme for thinking about the quality of democracy and the different dimensions of what I call a high-quality democracy, or, if you will, liberal democracy. But number two, if you think about it both from a logical standpoint and a normative standpoint, you see some issues that are extremely relevant to debates that are happening today, right now, about what kind of democracy people want and about the upsurge of the illiberal populist challenge to liberal democracy. Now, let me ask, does anyone know what the illiberal populist challenge is to liberal democracy? What are its critiques? Yeah?
So populism argues that the majority that is in power is corrupt and the people need representation, but the way they define the people is very loose and usually just indicates the majority. And in order for the people to have representation in government, that has to come at the cost of whatever the minority is.
Okay. So empowering a majority over minorities and kind of disempowering corrupt elites.
Yeah.
Anything else? Yeah?
Taking the responsiveness criteria to the extreme where government directly implements policies that the people want without regarding their best interest in the long run.
Okay.
That needs expertise.
Okay, so rapid, direct translation of popular preferences, or at least what the leaders manipulate and crystallize to be their depiction of popular preferences, into policies irrespective of their rationality or overall societal benefit. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Populists propose simple decisions for challenging problems that are unsustainable in their long-term perspective.
Okay.
There's also a skepticism of counter-majoritarian institutions like courts that prevent the perceived popular will from being directly enacted.
Okay, so if you're going to empower the majority and be responsive to them, you don't want other institutions that can constrain the popular will, which we can call counter-majoritarian. Very good.
So also, it seems like a lot of times liberal democracies go hand in hand with like globalization and this whole consensus with like free markets and all that, and that ends up taking away people's jobs, and people think that's unfair.
Okay, so it's certainly anti-globalization, and there's a kind of nationalist element to it. Anything else?
One thing that undergirds a lot of this is that there's a permanent sort of crisis mentality. So this, I think Courtney was saying something about how you want to undermine.
And why do you think there is a permanent crisis mentality?
Because that, I think, provides a justification for curtailing a lot of the sort of institutional
Okay,
constraints.
so it's certainly, if you have crisis or an emergency, then it justifies the curtailing of rights and normal procedures because there's a crisis, right? And you got to respond to it. So that is another dimension of the evisceration of checks and balances on the power of the majority and the embodiment of the majority, which is the elected leader. Yeah?
The sort of standing for citizenship is not based off of like universal suffrage. Oftentimes it's based off of some kind of ethnic identity.
Based on?
Some kind of ethnic identity. Or
Okay, so you've got an identity element to this that's very important. And often, of course, it depends on the country, but it's often the case that some kind of identity boundary is drawn around the people, quote unquote, and then others, ethnic minorities, who don't fall into the majoritarian conception of identity are seen as undeserving or less worthy or not the real people. So if you add all this up, this framework, which I've been using really at least since Leonardo and I published this article in 2004, comes into new and more vivid relevance, because the different dimensions of democratic quality can be grouped into these three categories, only one of which involves the purely democratic element of the people rule, the majoritarian element. And even within the category of the people rule, majority rule, as we will see when we look at the tension between consensual and majoritarian institutional arrangements, the majority rules is not the only way to structure democracy, and there's a big debate about whether it's the best way to structure democracy. But anyway, popular sovereignty, the people ruling in some way, is clearly a dimension of democracy. Having competition is another, and then a government that somehow results from the competition. Having participation, you mentioned the word responsiveness, and then vertical accountability. That means the government being held accountable by the people. Now, if you take vertical accountability seriously, it's already the beginning of a check on majoritarianism, because vertical accountability does not only involve the people voting in elections to hold their government accountable. It also involves what happens in between elections in terms of non-governmental organizations, civil society networks, social movements being able to raise concerns, expose wrongdoing, and demand redress. And so I would really like you to be thinking over the course of this class about the interactions across these three dimensions or groupings of dimensions of democratic quality, because often some of the most interesting, passionate, and democratically necessary forms of popular sovereignty involve civil society groups, social movements and actors working in between elections to try and activate these institutions of good governance that are not electoral institutions, and at least at a minimum, not majoritarian institutions, and could even be called contra-majoritarian institutions. But the idea here is that they seek fidelity to the rule of law and to the public interest beyond just an immediate reflexive responsiveness to the will of what an elected government says is the interests of the majority. So you've got this basket here, you've got the liberal basket of minority rights, protection for individual rights of all groups, and protection for all kinds of minorities, ethnic minorities, regional minorities, religious minorities, sexual identity minorities, whatever it might be. And this affirms also the principle, which is vital to a liberal democracy, that every individual has to have equal worth. In a human rights culture, which is a key foundation of a liberal democracy, equality of worth and therefore of rights is a pretty foundational notion. Now, of course, not everybody can really be equal, and the more you have economic inequality, the more you have a political foundation, a political momentum toward political inequality. And that's why we're going to get into the problem that inequality poses for democracy. a civic culture placed here rather than elsewhere. It seemed to be the best fit. It's a little bit transcending these, but it's a culture of commitment to democratic and liberal norms. And these include respect for the worth and equality of other individuals and for principles of fairness and inclusion, and not just the power of the majority to domineer over others. And then, of course, we have the rule of law, horizontal accountability. For the moment, think of it as checks and balances, and an accountable state. Now, before I move on to detail these very briefly, the whole populist, illiberal, and increasingly populist, nativist, and increasingly populist, I will say authoritarian complaint about liberal democracy is that it is unfairly and undemocratically holding the democracy basket hostage to these other two dimensions. Who are the courts to say what should be right in terms of what rights people have and don't have, and maybe even what rights non-citizens have? Who are the courts and the accountability institutions to say whether the elected leader should be constrained or not? These are all effete, unelected, intellectual university professors and statist professionals who are constraining and maybe violating the will of the people. And that's where the debate is turning now. It's an extremely interesting debate, intellectually and normatively. And this has led to the recent book by Yascha Mounk, I think it's called The People versus Democracy, that poses this issue of this backlash against judicial constraint, European Union constraint, accountability constraints, and just want to empower leaders to do what the people want. And what the people want, in part, it is claimed by those leaders, is to constrain immigration, fight globalization, fight European integration, and elevate the true, real, deserving people of the country.